Hello and welcome. This is October in 2011, and the next presidential election will be held more than a year from today, in November of 2012. But already the presidential campaign is taking off and is in full swing, with a tremendous amount of interest being shown, especially, of course, in the Republican campaign, because the Democratic nominee obviously will be Barack Obama, but the Republican nomination is still up for grabs. And there's been a series of debates by leading Republican contenders for the presidency, including one just a few nights ago. I'm not going to make a detailed analysis of the statements and the responses by the Republicans in this debate to the various questions, but there's two aspects of the debates, or two questions that came up during this most recent debate that I think reflect and says something about the society we live in, about American political life today, and underscore a very important aspect of American democratic society, especially this society of mass democracy involving the media and so forth. The debate underscores, I think, points up the lack of seriousness, the lack of principle in American society generally, and the frivolous and pandering way that our politicians operate in an effort to try to be elected president. In the debate the other evening, a question was asked about terrorism, whether any of the candidates would be willing to negotiate with terrorists. Well, predictably, as a knee-jerk reaction, candidate after candidate insisted that he would never negotiate with terrorists. Now, the reason for this, and the reason why politicians are quick to say this, is because the mass of people lack any larger or deeper historical understanding. It sounds good to say, I'm not going to negotiate with terrorists because it sounds tough. And after all, terrorists are bad. They're evil. And the mass of people like to hear politicians who condemn bad guys and make the audience feel like we're part of the good guys. Since terrorism is bad, we shouldn't have anything to do with it, and therefore we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. Now, although this appeals to a lot of people, this outlook and this way of putting things is childish, it's simplistic, and from any historical perspective, it's really pretty stupid. The implication that terrorists are evil or bad and that therefore we shouldn't have anything to do with them or negotiate with them, it's based on a simplistic view. Just any kind of historical perspective makes this obvious. The men who sacrificed to create an independent Ireland in the 20th century, for example, were justifiably condemned as terrorists. In the years before Ireland became an independent state, in the early 1920s, the movement for Irish independence was carried out by men whom the British understandably, justifiably condemned as terrorists. The high point of the Irish campaign for independence was the Easter Uprising of 1916, in which Irish nationalists seized control of parts of Dublin, including the post office. A siege took place. The men who were not killed in the uprising and who held out were arrested, and most of the leaders of the Irish nationalist uprising were executed for their role. One of those who was involved was Eamon de Valera. He was commandant of Irish volunteers, and he escaped being shot himself as one of the leaders of the Irish nationalist uprising, a terrorist uprising and a terrorist movement, because he was born in the United States and was therefore a U.S. citizen. For that reason, he was spared being shot along with other leaders of the Easter Uprising. Now later on, Eamon de Valera became Prime Minister of an independent Ireland. He was Prime Minister of the Irish Free State, or Irish Republic, during World War II, as well as during much of the 1950s. And later, until his death, he was President of the Irish Republic. Now, the Irish nationalist movement involved quote-unquote terrorism. But this has been characteristic of many movements in the past that most Americans are willing to say were carried out for a good or justifiable cause. And nobody in this right mind, nobody in America would think that the United States shouldn't have had anything to do with Eamon de Valera or other leaders of the Irish nationalist movement after Ireland became a state, because those men had been terrorists. Terrorism is illegal actions of killing, bombing, and physical violence by people in a cause who don't have state power. It's easy to condemn terrorism because violence carried out by a state is never called terrorism. Terrorists are only those who don't have a state. In the world today, especially here in the United States, Palestinian nationalists are called terrorists. Well, the Palestinians don't have an army. They don't have the power to carry out their policies with the same brutal force that Israel does. And so it's easy for Israel, of course, to condemn so-called terrorism because the Palestinians don't have state power in the way that Israel does. But in this debate that took place the other day, and in which Republican candidates were quick to insist that it would never have anything to do with terrorists, negotiating with terrorists, none would be willing to apply that standard to the leaders of Israel. The first group to introduce terrorism into the Middle East were Zionist activists, that is, Jewish nationalists who were seeking to create a Jewish state in Palestine. Two important leaders of the Jewish nationalist movement in Palestine, the Zionist movement, were Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, both who were condemned by the British, who was the authority in Palestine until 1948, both of whom were condemned as terrorists, and both of whom later became prime ministers of Israel, and were welcomed to the United States with all the fanfare of a leader of a foreign country, even though each of them had well-documented records as terrorists. But they were terrorists at a time when the Zionists did not have a state of their own in Palestine. Once they were in power and Palestinians were seeking justice for themselves and their rights, they carried out acts which Israelis and Americans, of course, condemned as terrorism. But terrorism, again, depends on what side they are and the circumstances. And a blanket statement by Republican leaders that they aren't going to deal with terrorism or terrorists is an example of the kind of rhetoric that is necessary, I suppose, in a mass democracy, because it appeals to the simplistic outlook of the mass of people, even though it is historically a short-sighted and stupid one. From 1979 until 1992, I think it was, for 14 years, there were Soviet troops in Afghanistan. And during that period of time, the United States backed resistance to Soviet control of Afghanistan. Among those people who were in the resistance was Osama bin Laden. And the resistance, the Afghan resistance, carried out numerous acts of terrorism. They would plant bombs, assassinate people, murder Soviet soldiers, and so forth. But the United States not only applauded this, it helped these terrorists with weapons and money and support, because this was part of the U.S. effort to stop the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And those politicians at this recent debate who insist that they'll never have anything to do with terrorists are saying this because they're appealing to voters who like to think of themselves in a sort of self-righteous way. Now, this is typical in a mass democracy. And it's one of the fundamental weaknesses of a mass democracy, because it means that in order to be elected, political leaders are compelled to say things that appeal to the most simplistic ideas of large numbers of people, but which are childish, simplistic, and stupid. During the debate, another question was asked about U.S. citizenship and whether the candidates were in favor of repealing the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment requires states that everyone born in the United States under the jurisdiction of the U.S. is automatically a U.S. citizen. Now, the point of the 14th Amendment, when it was enacted in 1868, was to ensure that former slaves and the children of former slaves would be regarded as U.S. citizens. That was the intent and purpose of that, so that the rights of citizenship of former slaves could not be taken away by southern states in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. But the language of the 14th Amendment means that anyone born in the U.S. is automatically a U.S. citizen. There's some debate about whether this could be changed by just legislation, in spite of the clear language of the 14th Amendment itself. But in any case, this is the way the law is written. Now, what's odd about this? There's a number of reasons why this is unusual. The United States is the only major important country in the world where citizenship is given to anyone who's born here. In most of the world, citizenship of a person is determined by the citizenship of the parents. So if a woman from France, for example, has a child in Britain, that child is a French citizen because the mother is a French citizen. Or if American parents have a child in Italy, the child is a U.S. citizen, not an Italian citizen. The U.S. is one of the very few countries in the world that gives citizenship automatically to anyone who is born here, regardless of the circumstances under which the mother or the parents come to the U.S. Now, this makes a mockery of citizenship law, which is one of the most important laws for any country, any society. The rights and duties of a citizen are among the most important that any country can lay out in law. But in our country, the 14th Amendment and American citizenship law is such that there has risen an industry of people who fly here to the United States from China, from Korea, from Turkey, and from other countries. Women who are pregnant come here to the U.S. in these circumstances to have their children in U.S. hospitals. They stay in nice hotels until the time they're supposed to give birth, and then the child born here is automatically a U.S. citizen, so that later the child, when it grows up, has all the advantages of U.S. citizenship, even though the whole intent and purpose of the mother in coming is simply for that purpose. They have no intention necessarily at all of actually living here. In addition, people who come to the United States illegally, who give birth to a child, give birth to a U.S. citizen. That is, even if the person born here is the child of an illegal alien, by U.S. law, that person is a U.S. citizen. Now, the reason I bring this up isn't merely because this issue came up in the presidential debate the other day. It's that the stupidity of this law, the frivolousness with which U.S. citizenship is given in this way to people who are born here, even of illegal aliens, and even of people who come here solely for a kind of tourist citizenship feature, that underscores the frivolousness of American citizenship law. It shows that the United States is not serious about citizenship by allowing this to be in place for as long as it has been. Now, in the debate that came up the other day, several of the candidates did say they would be in favor of repealing the 14th Amendment, of changing the law in that regard. But notably, one candidate, Rick Perry, refused even to respond to the question, to deal with it in any way, which will probably cost him some support. But more importantly than this is my point that neither political party over the past century that